So WarDogs just dropped a Q&A video answering a lot of major questions people have been asking about the game. Monetization, combat identity, matchmaking, performance, persistence, and early access timing. Now instead of speculating, we have direct answers from the developers themselves. So I wanted to go through this update, question by question, and talk about what their response actually suggests about the direction of WarDogs. Because sometimes what matters most isn't just what they say, it's what those answers reveal about the long-term design goals. Howdy everyone, I hope you're doing well. If you want to stay up to date on all the WarDogs news and updates, don't forget to like and subscribe. I publish content on MMOs and FPS shooters, so I hope to keep you in the loop with what you need to know. For anyone new to the game, WarDogs is a large-scale FPS built around 3 factions fighting over a massive battlefield. Matches can have up to 100 players, and instead of traditional score systems, the game revolves around an in-match cash economy. Every life you start with money, you spend that money on weapons, vehicles and equipment, and you earn more cash by contributing to your team. Things like reviving teammates, transporting players, holding objectives, and supporting the front line. It's not an extraction shooter, but it does have looting and economic decision making laid into each match, which gives it a slightly different feel compared to traditional Battlefield style shooters. So with that context in mind, let's get into the questions the developers answered. The first big question people wanted clarified was the overall combat identity of the game. Is WarDogs aiming to be more of an arcade shooter like Battlefield or Call of Duty? Or is it leaning towards something more realistic and tactical like Tarkov or Arma Reforger? From the developer response, it sounds like they're trying to sit somewhere in the middle. The gunplay and pacing are meant to stay accessible and fun, but with enough depth and tactical elements to give it weight. The next question was about progression and unlocks. People wanted to know whether you'll be able to unlock things just by playing the game, outside of the weapons and gear you'll buy during the match with an in-game economy. From what the developers explained, there'll be progression elements tied to playing the game rather than everything being locked behind purchases. There was also an obvious question about how 100 players divide across the 3 teams. They acknowledged that it doesn't divide evenly. It's up to 100 players, server caps can be adjusted, and players will drop in and out during matches. Realistically, they expect numbers to fluctuate somewhere between 27 and 33 players per team. What that tells us is that WarDogs isn't aiming for tightly controlled matchmaking symmetry. It's dynamic and fluid, which reinforces that this is more of an old-school server browser experience, rather than heavily relying on skill-based matchmaking. Next, they asked, will there be a cash shop, and will players be able to buy in-game money with real money? Their answer was very clear, no. They doubled down and said that there will be no paid skins either, and that if you see anyone with a skin, it should mean that they earned it through gameplay. That's a strong statement, especially for a multiplayer shooter in 2026. It matters because WarDogs is built around a per-life cash economy, where every decision revolves around money. If real money enters the loop, competitive integrity collapses very quickly. This is absolutely the right stance. The only thing is that it's easier to say no before launch. The real test will be whether the stance holds 2 years into early access, when revenue pressure becomes real. For now though, it's a very positive signal. Another question people had was about looting. What kind of things will players actually be able to pick up? Ammunition, medical supplies, equipment, weapons? The answer was essentially anything that could be purchased in-match. Ammunition, meds, other equipment. But this is not an extraction shooter. That distinction is important. Loot exists only within the session. There's no stash management, no gear fear economy, and no Tarkov-style extraction loop. That lowers friction and keeps the focus on the match itself rather than long-term inventory anxiety. In a genre that has seen a lot of extraction fatigue recently, that may be a smart move. Then there's performance. Running 100 players on a massive map in UE5 obviously raises questions about hardware requirements. The developers said performance had been a priority since day one. They even mentioned testing on what they consider a typical consumer gaming PC. Quote, we actually went to a local PC shop and said what's your standard gaming PC that somebody's mum would buy their kid? And we shoved it under the desk over there. That's our base spec. They did actually show a little sticky note with the specs, which I'll put on screen here, but we can see the specs are an i5 8600 CPU, 16GB of RAM, a GTX 1660 6GB, and a 1TB SSD. Can't quite make out what is above the 16GB RAM, but it looks like they're going for quite accessible specs for most gamers, as they want to maximize frame rate whilst keeping input latency in check. One question that naturally came up was whether WarDogs could become a Battlefield killer. The developers didn't position it directly that way, but the comparison is unavoidable. They're not trying to dominate the genre. Instead, their goal is a consistent 3K to 10K plays nightly, which is realistic and honestly it's healthy. Games that launch chasing dominance often collapse under inflated expectations. A sustained niche audience for WarDogs is a far more viable strategy long term. Matchmaking and team balance were also discussed. Players wanted reassurance that matches wouldn't constantly become one-sided steamrolls. They confirmed that there is no skill-based matchmaking. It's server browser only. As a deliberate design choice. Nowadays, modern shooters have become heavily shaped by skill-based matchmaking, which can drastically affect the quality of matches, especially when you're seen to be a more skilled player, placed in a higher skilled match and get absolutely stomped just because you had 1 or 2 good games. WarDogs is choosing unpredictability instead. That means sometimes you'll dominate and sometimes you won't. However, they emphasize that winning isn't the only goal. Earning cash and contributing to your team matters just as much, even on a losing side. That economic focus is clearly designed to reduce frustration from uneven matches. Whether that works in practice is something we'll only know once players get hands-on. Another practical question was about platforms. Right now, the primary focus is PC, which makes sense given the scale and complexity of the game. When it comes to persistence, early access will be relatively simple. Only cash carries over between matches. That keeps the system clean and focused on the core loop. For full release, they're planning broader meta systems, including player skills and progression elements outside the match itself. Meta systems can improve retention, but they also introduce complexity. The key question will be whether those systems enhance the core gameplay or start overshadowing it. For early access, keeping it simple is probably the right move. And finally, the question everyone really wants answered: when can we actually play the game? The developers confirmed that playtests and early access phases are planned, although exact dates are still unclear, but it sounds like they'll have something out by the end of the year. They expect to remain in early access for 12 to 24 months. That's a realistic timeframe for a large-scale multiplayer game, and suggests they understand iteration and community feedback will be critical. Overall, what this Q&A really shows is that WarDogs is trying to carve out a very specific space in the shooter genre. It's not trying to be a hardcore milsim, but it's also not aiming to be a completely casual arcade shooter either. Instead, it seems to be building a large-scale sandbox where teamwork, economy systems, and battlefield chaos all interact. If the developers can execute on those ideals while keeping performance stable and avoiding aggressive monetization, WarDogs could end up being one of the more interesting large-scale multiplayer shooters we've seen in a while. But, as always, with games like this, the real test will come when players finally get their hands on it during playtest and early access.